All right, we are here with Lee Fang at the Dissident Dialogues. How you doing today, Lee?
I'm great.
All right, so you just actually dropped an article, timely enough, about how this double standard on speech is being imposed right now around speech regarding Israel and Zionism. So Congress just passed a crazy bill that essentially would make it illegal to criticize Israel on college campuses. So you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, the bill, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, this is a piece of legislation that's been pushed for many years, but this bill in Congress and variations of it on the state level are now suddenly flooding capitals and state houses around the country. And essentially what it does, the federal legislation, is call on the government to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act with an eye towards anti-Semitism and a provision that defines anti-Semitism with the definition provided by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Now, this is a private organization, NGO, made up of many different countries, including the State of Israel, that has a list of terms and concepts that they include as anti-Semitism. Many of these terms include various forms of criticism of the State of Israel, one of which is the claim that the State of Israel is racist. Now, whether you agree or don't agree with this claim that the State of Israel is racist, that's a separate discussion. This is a clear violation of First Amendment rights. Any American citizen can say the American government's racist, the Canadian government's racist, any foreign government. This bill narrowly penalizes students and faculty at universities for criticizing the State of Israel. That's suppressing their speech around a foreign government. And, you know, this is just coming at a time of an incredible crackdown on speech rights. And there's an attempt to weaponize allegations of bigotry, just as we've seen in the last decade that there were some on the left that attempted to weaponize the term racist to stigmatize any of their political opponents, any Republican or anyone who opposed with their ideas. They were branded as a racist, and that's kind of an intellectual or mental shortcut to shut down any debate. The debate around Israel-Palestine, Israel's conduct in Gaza, is being shut down with the same mental shortcut of anti-Semitism. And that's really the intent and the effect of legislation like this, which, again, there's very similar versions of this popping up all around the country. And it would empower the Department of Education to cut off federal funding for certain universities where students or protests are engaged in rhetoric or debates that criticize the State of Israel.
Okay, so we were talking a little bit about this before. Now, this is a free speech conference, and I have really not heard people talking about this. We're in the middle of one of the greatest crackdowns on student speech since the Vietnam era. I mean, the greatest since the Vietnam era. Shouldn't civil libertarians be up in arms about that, no matter what your political ideology is?
They should be, but we're all human beings. We all have blind spots. I think there's a part of this is that there's maybe just desserts is the term. I'm not sure. A lot of these faculty members and student protesters have, in very recent history, as recently as last year and in the last decade, have been the vanguard of shutting down speech.
Sure.
They have been the censors. So there's a reluctance to embrace their cause, even though they're now the victims of state censorship. Look what happened to the University of Texas Austin, a place where it's supposedly a bastion of free speech, where the governor declared it a free speech zone. Now the governor is demanding that state troopers raid these pro-Palestinian camps and arrest and jail the students. Incredible hypocrisy there. There are many fair weather supporters of free speech. That being said, there are still many civil libertarians on the right who have been outspoken and very principled on this cause.
Massey.
Massey has been stronger than many Democrats.
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's an interesting coalition. The coalition that has raised important questions about military adventurism around the world, whether that's the expansion of NATO and the war in Ukraine, around Israel-Palestine, around the war in Yemen, and some concerns around Asia-Pacific, and around free speech rights at home. It's really the populists in Congress. It's elements of the Progressive Caucus and elements of the House Freedom Caucus. And unfortunately, the establishment is working in lockstep. It's, you have Nancy Pelosi, San Francisco liberal, really with no daylight between her, with Mike Johnson,
right,
Christian right nationalist, evangelical, on these very fundamental issues of speech and war. So, we've heard a little bit of discussion of this at this conference, but we obviously need a lot more.
Part of what's been very strange to me is, okay, on the one hand, you've had people arguing against the students in that spirit. This is the end of woke. Now, over the course of this conference, I'm forced to agree, but from the other side, because this is the end of a lot of civil libertarians who claim to really support free speech, because there seems to be an Israel exception. So not only is it the end of woke, I would say it's the end of anti-woke, because a lot of things that sounded very credible, I'm on that side ideologically. Like for the last 2 years ago, if I had heard a lot of this, I would say, right on. I mean, I was.
Yeah.
And now I'm listening and I'm saying, okay, well, but except for Israel? What happened?
Look, I think a lot of this debate gets obliterated in terminology. What is woke? For me, and I think maybe my definition differs from some of the folks here or elsewhere, but what we've seen is this kind of phenomenon where a identity politics group, a group of a racial or ethnic background,
right,
whether that's Black Americans, trans Americans, or Jewish Americans, and they take a deterministic view of history. They say because of a history of oppression, a history of discrimination and violence from the state and elsewhere, that there's permanently a oppressor-oppressed class, that we're always going to be victimized, and therefore we can respond with illiberal forms of behavior or structures, whether that's racial quotas that restrict whites, or a state of Israel that's an ethno-state that excludes others who are not Jewish. That's fundamentally, I think one could argue that Israel is a woke state. If Black Lives Matter, you listen to the rhetoric and the demands that they want self-determination for Black people, that Black people, because of the history of discrimination, deserve special rights. Not that we're a kind of a departure from the Enlightenment values that we're all equal under the law. They say no, that we should have different rules based on skin color.
Right.
Well, the state of Israel is not that different, but they're saying a different set of rules for people of Jewish descent. So, and in many ways, October 7th was a George Floyd moment for conservatives. This was such a painful event. This was such a gruesome, violent terrorist attack that it evoked the same psychological response that the George Floyd killing had. And we've seen this kind of overreach and hypocrisy, and people really kind of eviscerating their old values because they're in a state of shock and fear.
Now, you've also written about Ukraine. That's what you were on Jimmy's talking about. How Ukraine is actually, in a backdoor way, censoring Americans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been reading the contracts. The federal government, in some ways, they're completely opaque and non-transparent. In other ways, they're incredibly transparent. You can kind of read the lists of money going in and out. And I've been reading the contracts for USAID grants to groups that are setting up media outlets and journalists and watchdog groups in Ukraine as part of a democracy building program. These are a lot of the same contractors that worked in Afghanistan and Iraq after the invasion and occupation of those countries. But what differs here is that in Ukraine, many of these U.S.-funded media groups and disinformation watchdogs and what have you, they're supposedly set up to strengthen Ukraine's democracy and create a bulwark against Russian disinformation and a quality news source for the country. But you look at the behavior of these media outlets, they are attacking American critics of the war, very reasonable critics, very well-known critics, people like Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago professor, very well respected, and they're defaming them by claiming that these are Russian conspiracy theorists, Russian disinfo, and I look at what the contractors did in Afghanistan. They weren't producing this English language content. They weren't, the Afghan media outlets that we helped create with USAID weren't working with Facebook to help censor the internet. But the Ukraine awardees of USAID and State Department money, they're working as official partners with Meta, with Facebook and WhatsApp, to censor the internet. So in effect, what we have is that the US government is creating a messaging machine for the war that's not only designed for an information war with the Russians, but they're also affecting our own domestic debate of how we discuss American foreign policy discussions.
And again, why don't you see more people on the right speaking out about this? Because it seems to only be, okay, so this is what I feel is not represented. There's an anti-woke left. There's a left that's not into speech codes and all that, and it seems to be invisibilized from the conversation, giving one the impression that the only people speaking out about these things are Republicans, or Thomas Massey, or conservatives, or libertarians. Whereas, I mean, I assume you identify as left, right?
On many issues, yeah. I mean, I've worked for left-wing outlets my entire career until last year, and I've gone solo on Substack. But on traditional left-wing ideas of class and, controlling the power of the corporate state, sure, I'm on the left. Maybe on some other areas I'm not, but yeah, it's a very lonely experience because there are not many other people in this world. Especially on issues where you saw people on the left criticizing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan,
Right.
Looking very critically at the role of government contractors in these conflicts, questioning the military's narratives about their progress in those conflicts. The military lied to us for 20 years in Afghanistan, but now we see many on the left in Congress and in the media not really expressing any skepticism about what the military claims on Ukraine.
Yeah, that continues with Ukraine, even as there are these massive protests in other areas. Yes, the image of what kind of fits the bill of a settler colonial state committing this kind of mass slaughter against brown people, I do think fits the post-colonial studies that they've been reared in.
Yeah.
I think what's happened here is the establishment never intended that to interfere with their agenda. That's why they backward focused it. They never talked to these kids about what's happening now. They talked about slavery from 150 years ago. They talked about the colonial era and painted this picture. We're past that. So yes, there is a certain schadenfreude that these kids who were trapping Riley Gaines in a classroom a year ago are suddenly facing this. But what do you think that's going to do to this generation? In conclusion, what do you think they're
this
going to...
is a big picture question. I don't know how I can answer it, but I think fundamentally the part of what you just said is that some of these officially supported left-wing movements, when I mean officially, I mean look what happened with Black Lives Matter, Google, Amazon, the whole Fortune 500 throwing money at these groups, politicians kneeling and saying they support the agenda, major foundations, billionaire-backed foundations promising unlimited support, and compared to some of these anti-war movements, we see kind of a difference in material and official support. I think there was a cynical level there where they didn't actually see any fundamental threat to the ruling class. That, at worst, maybe we'd get some new HR managers who call themselves DEI, and some changes to some forms of policing around the edges, although fundamentally not much changed about policing at all. If anything, we saw some pullback of policing in low-income communities that have actually been kind of a travesty as the homicide, violent crime has gone up.
Right.
But fundamentally, do we see any structural change in America in terms of class and power? No. And that wasn't the focus of those protests. It was this kind of, discussion of history and symbolism,
Right.
not a kind of a materially grounded critique of American society. And this current movement, what we're seeing now is, there's a lot of silly stuff that happens in protests. There are extremists. There are people that fundamentally don't understand what's going on in Gaza and Israel. They think it's a race thing, even though the Mizrahi Arab Israelis, Jewish Israelis, are also brown. Like it's like we want to project our own racial identity politics on every conflict, but it's much more complicated there.
Sure.
I don't know where it ends up, but it's very different from previous protests.
All right, Lee, where can people find you?
Substack at leefang.com. That's Fang.
All right, I am a subscriber. Check him out. He does great work. Thank you, Lee.
Hey, thank you so much.
Please clap.